Hello. Hello to the Director of the INSS, Major General in Reserves Amos Yadlin. Hello to the former Chief of General Staff Gadi Eisenkot. My name is Sima Shine. I'm the Director of the Iran program in the INSS, and I'm very happy to open our discussion of Iran and all the different issues that we are facing nowadays regarding COVID-19 and the impact of that situation in Iran over Israel. The participants in today's discussions are our partners from inside the INSS and outside of it. I'll introduce them briefly. Professor Meir Litvak, who's a fellow researcher at the Alliance Center. He's a renowned scholar in Israel and all over the world. Dr. Liora Hendelman-Baavur, the Alliance Center for Iranian Studies Director at the Tel Aviv University. Colonel in Reserves Eldad Shavit, a researcher in the INSS. Dr. Raz Zimmt, who is a researcher in the INSS and in the Alliance Center. Dr. Fadlon, who's a researcher on various economic topics on the INSS. And out of all of these, with all these experts, we'll discuss the conduct of the Iranian regime regarding all the issues that are still on the agenda despite the corona, whether it's the domestic situation, the economic situation, the relationship with the U.S., and of course the nuclear issue. The first subject I'd like to start with, and of course all of these things and how they impact Israel's national security, and where does that open up both risks and opportunities for Israel. So I'd like to start with the coronavirus, COVID-19, but that is, of course, part of a broader set of problems that the Iranian regime is dealing with. Let's start with Professor Raz Zimmt. Raz, please. Dr. Raz Zimmt. Hello, everyone. I'd like to start with a comment about the figures. This comes up often in the media, and people often ask me, can we rely on the official numbers from Iran? According to the official numbers, we're talking about 18,000 people who are ill, over 5,000 who have died of COVID-19. The question is, are these numbers reliable? Well, the bottom line is that undoubtedly the real numbers are much higher than that. How do I know? The Iranians themselves are saying that there's a report from an Iranian research center from a week ago. They are talking about the number of fatalities that's probably twice as high. There are reports that I think are, exaggerated by the Iranian opposition, and they're talking about 25,000 people who have died, and that's inflated. But so is the actual number twice as high as the official number or more than that? I don't know. In the initial stages of the pandemic, when it was pretty clear that the regime is trying to both conceal and cover up some of the information, the way I see it, the main difference now stems from a different methodology. What do I mean? In that report I mentioned earlier, they're not claiming that it is intentionally concealing the regime. They're saying that when it publishes the number of people who have died, they do not include in the statistics of the people who have not been diagnosed with COVID-19, the people who died at home and not at hospitals. And of course, that reduces the number of fatalities. So we have to say from the outset that it's completely obvious that the numbers are much higher than the official numbers reported by the Iranians. And as for the conduct of the Iranian regime, I would like to make four main comments. My first comment is that I think we need to make a distinction between the way in which the Iranian regime has dealt with the pandemic at the first stage, and I'm referring to the stage from when the pandemic had arrived at Iraq, the virus had arrived at Iran, and the regime knew that. We're talking about the end of January, the beginning of February, the latest, and the second stage, which is the beginning of March. During the first stage, the response of the Iranian regime, it was hesitant, slow, and confused. We definitely know that between 2 or 3 weeks at least had elapsed from the moment in which the regime had known about confirmed COVID-19 cases in Iran until it took the most, minimal measures. For example, even after the regime had announced that they stopped all flights from China because of the outbreak of COVID-19, of the coronavirus in China, Mahan Air, which is owned by the Revolutionary Guards, they continue to carry out flights between China and in Iran. And we know that the source of the pandemic in Iran is either Chinese merchants or Chinese clergymen and students who were in Iran. They had a very hesitant reaction. They didn't impose even a partial lockdown on Qom. They continued with sports activities. Schools carried on. They didn't stop anything. They didn't impose any restrictions on movement in the streets and on work. And at that stage, we saw a very confused kind of conduct. They didn't know who's responsible. Initially, the president said that it's the Minister of Health who's responsible for taking care of the pandemic. And then he was harshly criticized even by the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, who said, how can it be? It's inconceivable that you as president do not conduct the daily meetings. And then in March, the leader said, I appoint you, the leader, to head the committee dealing with corona. And then 2 days later, he appointed the same leader, the head of the armed forces, to head a certain healthcare directors. And we see a clash between the president and the armed forces. There's one event that is memorable, that the chief of general staff, Bakiri, who said, we're going to shut down all the streets within 24 hours. And then a few hours later, the president said, I have no intention to impose a general lockdown. So this is a very confused reaction. The second stage in March, then we see that the penny has dropped. And once the penny has dropped, and it doesn't only have to do with the number of people who died, but because during the first stage, a significant portion of those who died were senior ranking officials. And then we start to see some kind of an emergency routine that's more or less reasonable. The second comment has to do with the main consideration that guides the regime, and that's the economic consideration. And undoubtedly, when we look at this pendulum, and we see this in Israel, is this pendulum between public health and the economic consideration at a very early stage of the Iranians. I'm not saying that, they had complete disregard for public health, but definitely they gave a much great significance to the economic aspect, and we'll hear about that later. And the main fear of the regime that they will not be able to provide the required measures needed in order to support several million more people who are unemployed. So they wanted to make sure not only that people are healthy, that people can earn a living. And even when they were talking about imposing the restrictions and in the exit strategy, we see that this is a main consideration. That same president who in 2015 said that the centrifuges have to turn, but so does the economy. This is the same president who's saying now it's true that the public health is top priority, and this is why we need to maintain social distancing, but the economy, the wheels of the economy have to keep churning. And today they are talking about an exit strategy. They have lifted all restrictions of vehicle movement between regions, and now restrictions have been lifted inside Tehran, and except for specific situations or those professions that are at high risk, they are pretty going back to normal. My other comment has to do with the Revolutionary Guards. This is a very important topic. Emergency situations in principle in every country, that makes it possible for various security elements to become more involved in the situation. This is the case in Israel as well, and the Revolutionary Guards have entered this situation to a great extent. They are compensating for the weaknesses of the government. Here in Israel, in the past 2-3 days, we've heard about this strange reporting about Salami, the commander of the Revolutionary Guard, that came with this strange gadget that's supposed to detect COVID-19. Somebody from England sold it to them, but that's not the serious issue. The serious issue that you can see the Revolutionary Guards in the Besiege using all of their capabilities, and they have a lot of capabilities in order to mobilize hundreds of thousands of people to combating COVID-19, whether it's manufacturing masks and gloves, opening up hospitals, opening up regional headquarters. And this is something very significant. And maybe later we'll want to talk about the stability of the regime. So it's important to say that the Besiege and the Revolutionary Guards are going into areas that can in the future help them in such scenarios as dealing with unemployment. And today, every Iranian has to report to the Revolutionary Guards about a next of kin who has died, because the besieged, they have to be present in the funerals, and that means giving additional control to the Revolutionary Guards. My last comment has to do with the tension, and we ordinarily see this tension, but also definitely in this crisis, the tension between ideology and the more pragmatic nature of the regime. What do I mean? I mean, there were definitely ideological considerations in the conduct of the regime, definitely in the initial stages, when the representative of the leader in Qom said, not only am I not going to allow closing down the main mosque, but I'm even inviting people to come to mosque because that will make them healthy. This is an ideological, religious consideration, and that prevented them from closing down the mosques in Qom for a long time. And the fact that they're spreading this conspiracy theories that's the Americans who are responsible for this biological weapon against the Iranians, and the fact that they're not only refusing American aid, but they even refuse to accept a delegation of, doctors, Physicians Without Borders, this French NGO, because they're from the West. These are all ideological considerations. But once the penny does drop, one can see how once again the Iranians are adopting a much more pragmatic approach. Maslahat is how they call it in Farsi. That means the interest of the state is now at center, and then they are willing to accept the IMF assistance. They're willing to shut down the religious colleges and the mosques, and that's now what's guiding them is the interest of the state. Thank you, Raz. Now let's move on to Liora. Raz talked about the regime. Liora will talk a bit about the society. How are the Iranian people dealing with this new situation? Well, hi everyone. What I'd like to say is pretty much connected to what Raz just said. And this crisis started in Iran. When it started in Iran, pretty quickly it was marked as a country in which COVID-19 erupted in the most severe case in the Middle East. And even globally, it was ranked number 3 after China and Italy. And because of this high ranking of the eruption of the pandemic, it drew a lot of interest from the whole world and from international media. So we actually learned a lot of information regarding what's going on there. And many other countries looked at Iran, scrutinized Iran in order to understand how this pandemic evolves and progresses and what are the right reactions and responses to it. Let me say that at the first stage, if we're talking about crisis management in general, well, you could say that crisis management has several stages, prevention and regulation, preparedness, reaction, and the recovery phase. And we are still in the different stages of response and recovery, or we're trying to get there. And in this respect, we'll have to make that distinction mentioned by Raz as well, regarding the conduct of the regime, but also to a great extent it was a reaction to the way in which in a society where there are so many restrictions on the means of communication and media, whether it's the internet or regular media outlets such as radio and TV, and we saw how important rumors and the grapevine can be, and the reaction actually came because there were so many rumors circulated in Iran regarding the possibility that there are people who are infected with COVID-19, whether it was in Qom or students who studied in Wuhan in China and have returned to Iran and are perhaps ill. There was the student who filmed this video about, he videotaped the hospital in Qom that was under lockdown. That was in 18th or 19th of February. Just 2 days before the elections, and he said that no information is given because the regime wants to hold the elections and not create panic. And so this circulation of rumors that forced the regime to react and respond. Initially, there was this attempt, they suspended doctors and hospital directors, and they informed journalists and editors of news agencies not to disseminate any information that COVID-19 has arrived at Iran. They really tried to stop it very fiercely, but ultimately they were forced to provide some kind of information. So what I'm trying to say here is that at first stage, Iran found itself in a certain, information catch, disinformation catch. Initially, there were contradictions between the stats published by the regime. They claimed that the numbers are actually much higher than those that were made known, and there was distrust towards the information released by the regime. And as a result, people simply did not obey the instructions of the regime. And for example, when people were encouraged not to leave home, and that made it very difficult for the regime to make sure that the means it enacted in order to stop the pandemic were actually being carried out. And there were also people who exploited this distrust towards the regime for various political or economic considerations, and they started to disseminate disinformation. And it wasn't just oppositional organizations from outside of Iran with a certain vested interest, but somebody spread the rumor that methanol, that industrial alcohol can immunize the body from COVID-19. And we know that in the past 2 months, at least according to the report, 728 people over the past 2 months have died of alcohol poisoning. And they say that it's about 20% of the people who died of corona. So that created a problematic situation with respect to the need of the regime to address everything that's happening amongst the population. Now I'd like to briefly address in bullet points but a few things that can teach us something about public opinion inside Iran. And this is based on a poll, a survey held in October 2019 in the School for Public Policy in the University of Maryland. And they've been publishing since 2013 all kinds of surveys in order to know what's happening in Iran. And that includes a sample of 1,000 Iranians. It was conducted over the past year. And I simply added this to different other surveys published by the ISPA, the survey agency of Iranian students, and all the surveys they have published regarding public opinion trends in Iran, as much as you can rely on these surveys. And now I'd like to briefly talk about the trends. One of the main trends has to do with the increase in negative opinions towards the U.S., and perhaps we are reaching a certain low in the position of the Iranian public towards the U.S. And before COVID-19, it was mainly because Trump had opted out of the Jcpoa. But even before that, there was certain frustration with the fact that the U.S. did not uphold its part of the agreement. As for the COVID-19, the coronavirus crisis, there are also elements of the healthcare system. Even before that, medical teams and doctors and different organizations in Iran were saying that American sanctions are denying them of the ability to treat people who are terminally ill with cancer, people with blood diseases, with cardiac diseases. And here, the coronavirus had impacted their outcry, and the fact that they were saying how terrible the sanctions are, and that the fact that they were preventing humanitarian and medical assistance, and all that was because of the U.S. From the foreign ministry, the Iranian foreign ministry, they weren't talking about medical terrorism or health terrorism, but definitely they said that they were begging for humanitarian assistance. And alongside that survey conducted by the University of Maryland found that many Iranians were actually holding positive opinions regarding countries such as China, Russia, Japan, Germany. And now I would like to talk a bit about China, because we can see that there are certain changes in how the people in Iran treat China. At the beginning of February, the authorities in Iran were certain that coronavirus will not reach Iran, and following what they called as mask diplomacy, they had donated 2 million masks, surgical masks that were manufactured in Iran. They donated it to China in order to help China in, battling the coronavirus. And then about 10 days later, it was discovered that there's a shortage of masks in Iran, and in the social media, networks, they blamed the establishment's irresponsibility with that donation. On top of that, there was harsh criticism over the fact that there were still flights to and from China, and while the rest of the world stopped all these flights. And even the Minister of Interior Affairs of Iran said that there won't be any more flights to Iran, and the airliner denied that there are such flights, but actually these flights continued. And people in Iran thought that this relationship with China, as a result of it, the people view the regime as a regime that prioritizes its ideology over public health. But this resentment towards China did not end there, but it was also considered to be part of the regime's hidden agenda. And any attempt to harm the relationship between Iran and China, this encounters a blank wall from the government. And the spokesperson of the Ministry of Health, who's now a media star in Iran, I'm talking about Kihanusha Jaunpur, and he recently said that China initially concealed the scope of the people who became ill with coronavirus and those who died of it. And he was reprimanded by the Chinese ambassador in Iran. But on top of that, harsh criticism was leveled at him. And the Iranian Foreign Ministry, they even wondered, did he become an Israeli or American agent? Because he was trying to sabotage this important relationship between Iran and China. Another trend one could see from this survey, and it has to do with the Iranian economy and corruption. And this has to do with the points of emphasis that now many Iranians are preoccupied with. Perhaps at the beginning of this year, the emphasis was on unemployment. Now it's concern with inflation. And even though the issue of corruption is still relevant, still we can see growing accusations that target the sanctions, the economic sanctions. And we see from the survey that many Iranians claim that since the economic situation is pretty bad anyhow, 2 more months of a lockdown or an economic slowdown in order to help public health, that won't, deteriorate the situation that much. Okay, why don't we pause here, Liora? We will get back to you later. Now I'd like to move on to Tomer, and you just mentioned the economy and the fact that the Iranian people think that 2 more months of a failed economy won't really aggravate their situation. Okay, let's see my presentation, please. Great. Let's move to the next slide. At the introduction, I'm just presenting several points of how the coronavirus crisis is impacting the Iranian economy. It is harming the efforts to adapt the economy to the sanctions, and that mainly means to non-energy GDP. These efforts actually were quite successful over the past 2 years. They said we definitely developed our non-oil GDP significant, and also tourism that was very developed in Iran during 2019 and has been significantly harmed by the coronavirus, and also the damage to the local currency and the damage caused to the oil market, and that's as a result of a dramatic combination of the sanctions and the oil war between Russia and Saudi Arabia, with the U.S. in the background, and of course the corona crisis, which has led it to an all-time low. Definitely, if we're talking about the Iranian aspect of oil export, this is an all-time historic low, and of course the damage caused to their foreign trade. Let's move on to the first slide that has to do with Iranian oil export. As you can see, since 2015 until 2018, it has been on the rise as a result of the Jcpoa. As a result of the U.S.'s seceding from the Jcpoa and the economic sanctions, it had dropped dramatically in 2019. In 2019, we still had the certain exemptions the U.S. gave to certain countries, so the damage was not as significant as the one we'll see in 2020. So less than 500,000 oil barrels for export a day. That's, a low that has not been seen since the Iran-Iraq war in March. We're talking about 144,000 oil barrels exported by Iran. It's definitely an all-time low. Now, let's move on to the next slide. Main trade partners of Iran, you can see the great contribution China has to the Iranian economy, and it shows us how already at the end of January, when it started suffering from the coronavirus, China immediately it had an economic impact on Iran because China is its number one trade partner. China provides a quarter of Iran's import. Iranian export, that's non-oil. The non-oil exports, 1/4 of it goes to China. A third of Iranian oil is also exported to China. So we're talking about significant damage already back in January, February in international trend. According to the IMF, in a report published last week, the trade deficit, Iran's trade deficit from 2020 will be $19 billion. The export is 46 and the import is $65 billion. And we are talking about a historic all-time low. By the way, let's go back to the previous slide. I'd just like to say one thing regarding the trade. I mentioned some negative things, but from the Iranian perspective, there are several good things. The American sanctions during the past 2 years caused China and this is what other economies in the world have experienced recently. It made them more self-reliant, relying on their own domestic capabilities. And we didn't see that many empty supermarket shelves in Iran as we saw in Italy. So this self-capacity was developed thanks to the American sanctions. They are very adaptive to sanctions. They have learned how to live with sanctions. Now this slide presents the growth projection in Iran. 2019, we're talking about the economy was projected to shrink by 19%. And actually, there were very optimistic projections for 2020, especially in view of the non-oil related industries, the development in these industries. But we see things now going down. And now the updated projection of the IMF, we're talking about a 6% drop in the GDP. For 2021, there's an optimistic projection of the IMF from the Iranian perspective. That's 3%. By how much did it go down in 2019? 6%. Now, the next slide. We can see the exchange rate of the Iranian currency in comparison to the real. And you could see how when the sanctions were gradually imposed in the spring of 2018, people rushed to the dollar. We can see these fluctuations and how they go up once again at the beginning of 2020 as a result of the coronavirus crisis. And this forced the Central Iranian Bank to use its foreign currency reserves. And we can see that they often use the foreign currency reserves as a result of the sanctions in order to balance out the exchange rate, the domestic currency exchange rate, and I guess the foreign currency reserves will increase to 70 billion, decrease to $70 billion in a matter of a few months. Now, the next slide, the economic response of the government. Of course, there's the issue of the lockdown, going into it and getting out of it. They started it at a very delayed stage, and because of their economic concerns, and they lifted the lockdown pretty early also because of the economic issues. They fear that this will impact the GDP by more than 10%, and the economy dictates the Iranian policy towards COVID-19. What did the regime do after a very hesitant economic reaction? because of the ineptness of the government, we can see that they did do a few things. There were loans and subsidies for households and businesses who encountered problems, the payment of allowances and benefits. At the beginning of April, Khamenei said that $1.1 billion can be withdrawn from the National Development Fund. This is a fund of several billions of dollars. It's not a massive fund, but the purpose is to deal with economic shocks, with situations that you have to. And does that have something to do with the 83 billion? No, 83 billion, that's the foreign exchange reserves, foreign currency reserves. And that does not include this fund. No, it does not. And an exceptional request, and it's important to understand how exceptional it is from a historic perspective from the IMF for a $5 billion loan. Why is it exceptional? Because it's for the first time since the inception of the Iranian Islamic Republic in 1979 that they are asking anything of the IMF. We're talking about a very bad economic situation, and it's only going to worsen, but we're still not talking about economic collapse. We need to think about Iran in the same terms that we're thinking about the coronavirus. Who dies of COVID-19? People who have pre-existing health conditions. And Iran also has a pre-existing condition. It was in a very difficult economic state, but it's not about to collapse. It still can adapt to changes and deal with this new reality. Thank you, Tomer. I think that the economic input gives us a complete picture of the situation in Iran with respect to its regime, its economy, and its society. Now I'd like to ask Raz and Liora a short question, and please make the answer even shorter. This situation we've just heard about so far, is it risky for the stability of the regime? Can we say that the regime today is less stable than it was 2 months ago? Thank you. Yes, Raz, please. Regarding the stability of the regime. I mean, it's always very difficult to project that. Let me answer this briefly. You must ask yourself two questions. First of all, in view of the serious exacerbation of the economic situation, will we see the protests being renewed in Iran? Definitely. We've seen in the past 2.5 years since the large wave of the end of 2017 and then the fuel protest in 2019, 2020, we can see that the protests are always with an economic background. So the current situation can encourage these protests. The more significant question, though, if it will erupt, the protest, will it be more effective than what we've seen in the past 2 years? I'm not sure at all, because we are very much aware of the weaknesses of this protest movement. It has no leadership, and, the middle class hasn't joined it, and many people in Iran fear a loss of stability and chaos. Therefore, they continue to carry on with the existing situation, and the regime has enough capabilities to oppress protests. These things are not going to change. I think now you've seen that the organizational capabilities of the Revolutionary Guards have even improved since COVID-19. The middle class doesn't want to go out to the streets and protest because those who still have a job left are very fearful of losing their workplace. So even if it will erupt the revolution, you have to be very careful. And you need to ask yourself, will it be more effective than what we've seen in the past 2 years? I don't think so. What do you think, Liora? I agree with most of what Raz said. I have to say that the crisis has the nuclei for success and the roots for failure. At the first stage, it seemed that we have here certain roots that would encourage failure and collapse, but that's what we thought at the beginning. But now we see the ability of the Iranian regime to deal throughout the years, not just with economic sanctions, but with all different types of crises. Over the past year, they had to deal with an earthquake, with flooding of entire regions in Iran, and one of the outcomes or the measures mentioned in the survey I mentioned earlier is that even though most of the participants in that survey are not too sympathetic of the Revolutionary Guards, yet they were very pleased in the way in which the Revolutionary Guards managed the crisis of the major floodings in March and April of 2019. And now we can see images coming from Iran, and we can see the Revolutionary Guards and, the guys from the Basij, on their motorbikes, all of them in protective gear, and they are, spraying and disinfecting every nook and cranny in the streets and every school, and people see how efficient they are. So, there are all kinds of elements of support. I don't know whether to call this support, but definitely We're talking about an improvement in how most people view the Revolutionary Guards and the Basij and their effectiveness and their ability to provide a response while the other sectors don't really provide such a response. And I have to say that, that sector of the educated urban middle class, they are the ones who are actually much more fearful of this crisis, and they exhibit concern for their family members. And I think that this is a top priority for them right now, and not so much are we going to go out to protest and topple the regime and, create even greater chaos than the existing one. Thank you, Liora. I think both of you have pointed at very important points. And as you remember, part of Trump's policy, it wasn't a declared policy, it was to topple the regime. But the people around him, like Bolton, for example, they said that they hope that all of this pressure will topple the regime. So from what I understand from the two of you, and I have to say that I concur, that it doesn't seem like it's going to happen anytime soon. Now, Liora mentioned the Revolutionary Guards and how the people view them. And this leads us to the next issue, and this is Iran's behavior and conduct in the region. And that is led to a great extent by the Revolutionary Guards and the Quds Force, mainly Soleimani, who's no longer with us, and now his successor. And I'd like to ask Professor Litvak if you could perhaps comment on that. And afterwards, we will have some more questions regarding this area. Okay, hello everyone. I'd like to say a few things, and I'd like to say something about the relationship between domestic and foreign affairs. I don't think that the coronavirus pandemic has changed the foreign policy of Iran. Maybe it's a small bump on the road, but it does not lead to any significant change. It means that the way the regime is functioning during this crisis, as we've just heard from Raz and Liora, the economic situation, which is pretty dire, but it's not, on the verge of collapse, and everything else mentioned, the sentiments mentioned by Liora, and, actually it's a green light for the regime that they're safe. They feel confident in their policy, and they are feeling that they can carry on with their foreign policy. Let me say something about the protest. It won't happen, on the first stage, because people need to recover and recuperate. Maybe later we'll see protests, but now that people are concerned with their survival, they won't take the streets. That's something we know from history. I think that we can see that they are increasingly self-confident, the Iranians. The regime feels that it has, overcome the most difficult part, and now it can continue to promote its regional and international interests just like it did before the crisis, and perhaps it even has a small advantage now. It's important to say that when the crisis started, the Iranians tried to exploit it in order to lift the sanctions. They tried to say, oh, poor us, we're in a difficult situation. What about morals and humanitarian? And, if the women die in the corridors in our hospitals, it's all your fault. But that didn't work. What it did do, and this serves the regime, just like Liora said, it increases anti-American sentiments amongst the Iranian public, and that the interests of Khamenei, maybe not Rouhani, but definitely the interests of him and the Revolutionary Guards and these kind of elements in the regime. And after they were disappointed with the Americans, and the Americans did not agree to lift the sanctions, they resorted back to the regular policy to separate between the U.S. and the other elements. The IMF, for example, it's not dominated by the Americans, but by the Europeans. The World Bank is dominated by the Americans. So they're trying to increase the rift between the Americans and all the others. On the other hand, we can see the response of Khamenei, when he tries to accuse the Americans that the pandemic is their fault, and he also refuses to receive help from the U.S. And here we can say that this increased this basic sense of loathing of Khamenei and other conservatives in Iran towards the U.S., and that was merely exacerbated following the crisis. And this past week, as an expression of their growing self-confidence, is what the Revolutionary Guards did to the American ship. And that means that they are going back to their previous policy of challenging the Americans and, thinking or knowing that the Americans won't react. And that is definitely an indication of their self-confidence. And last Thursday, there was a provocative statement of the commander of the Navy, and he said that Iran was considering to develop a submarine that would be powered by a nuclear reactor. That shows their self-confidence. That's being defiant towards the Americans, and that means that this will enable Iran to go ahead with their nuclear program, because they're saying we're going to develop a nuclear submarine, and now that will give us the legitimacy to continue to develop our nuclear capabilities without violating the JCPOA. That shows us that there is no willingness to compromise with the Americans. Anybody who thought that they would, fall down to their knees and beg the Americans and concede to them, I guess this is not going to happen anytime soon. They're not going to surrender to the Americans. And also with China, we're talking about a strategic need. It's not something ideological. But if I'm talking about the regional arena, I have to say that the Iranians can look around and feel pretty satisfied. And now I'd like to quote what Raz wrote 7 or 10 days ago. He wrote that there was no change in the Iranian strategy. On the contrary, their activities in Iraq show that Iran is continuing to promote its interests and is even gaining some wins there. Maybe not on their own, but they managed to make sure that a pro-American candidate will not be elected as Prime Minister of Iraq. They showed that they have some kind of a veto power over what's happening in Iraqi politics. Kahani, the successor of Soleimani, it's important to say, has managed to successfully pass his first diplomatic test. He managed to impose a candidate that all Iraqi militias agreed about. And I have to say that from the outset that, when we parted with Soleimani, I didn't think that Iran would not be able to recover. I said back then that Iran does not depend on one person. Maybe Kahani doesn't have the charisma of Soleimani, but it doesn't mean that he cannot promote the Iranian interests by continuing his work. And we can see that Iran still can influence Iraq, still has levers there. And the Iranians are continuing with their policy of harassing the Americans in Iraq in order to kick them out of Iraq by controlled shooting and attacks of Shiite militias in order to get rid of the Americans in Iraq. And I think that time is in the favor of the Iranians, because as we approach the election campaigns in the U.S., Trump will not be able to react. And that will present Trump with a very serious dilemma. And maybe what the Iranians actually want is to get the Americans completely outside of Iraq. And maybe the Americans will say that they're leaving Iraq in order to recover from the corona and shut down any infected bases. So I think this plan is working pretty well for them. And if we look at another area, I guess there is a certain slowdown in their establishing themselves in Syria and their ability to help Hezbollah. And it's because, of course, the economic problems and the coronavirus crisis. But I don't think that Iran is completely outside the picture. I think that in Syria as well, they still have many levers. They're still very influential. And, there's a certain division in the Syrian military between pro-Iranian and pro-Russian divisions. And we can see that the Iranians can still make sure that the people they want are appointed. And in Yemen as well, the Houthis who are getting more established in Yemen, if we look at things from the regional perspective, their efforts have not been harmed. On the contrary, considering the fact that in this significant crisis we can see in Iraq and Saudi Arabia that is very much engrossed with its own domestic affairs, Iran can look around at the region and feel pretty pleased, pretty satisfied with everything that's happening. And I guess also because there is domestic support of the public opinion in Iran for their foreign policy. Thank you very much, Meir. I would say that we have questions from the audience for you and for others as well. We'll get to that later. I would like to now say a few words about the nuclear program, and then we'll hear about the U.S. and how it is dealing with all that, and then we'll open up the discussion and hear some additional comments. Let me say about the nuclear issue. Next month, the month of May, will be the first anniversary for the year, the 1-year anniversary for Iran's announcement that now the U.S. has phased out of the Jcpoa. Iran is also less committed, and we find ourselves in the situation that Iran has phased out most of its main commitments in the Jcpoa, and the fact that it is no longer committed to all of its commitments regarding Iranian enrichment. And there's one thing they did keep, and that's the oversight of the IAEA, which continues to supervise the situation in Iran. And on this topic as well, several times over the past few weeks during the coronavirus crisis, they have said that now that they phased out of the technological aspects, they can phase out of the legal aspects, and that means the supervision based on the Jcpoa or NPT or the additional protocol. They haven't done so yet, but they're threatening to do so. And what that means is that Iran is accumulated enriched material at a low grade at this point, but it knows how to enrich a high grade and even weapons grade. And now they have started operating yet another facility that was inactive until now because it was shut down by the Jcpoa. The Iranians have announced that they are continuing in an accelerated pace with the manufacturing of advanced centrifuges, and this will significantly increase the quantity of enriched uranium they can accumulate. And something that happened 10 days ago on April 8th, that's Nuclear Day in Iran. Usually there are a lot of ceremonies held and announcements are made regarding different achievements. And this time, because of COVID-19, no ceremonies were held, but still they announced certain achievements. And I'd like to mention 2 or 3 points out of these achievements. One was already mentioned briefly by Meir earlier, and that's with the submarines that are powered by a nuclear reactor. We know that the Iranians have already brought this up a few times over the years, over the past few years, and they're saying that because this kind of reactor requires high-level enrichment, sometimes 60%, but sometimes even 90%, which is weapons grade. Now, that's very difficult to achieve, and only very few superpowers in the world know how to do that, but to a great extent, the Iranians are preparing the public opinion and informing the world that they plan to do so, and that this will give them a civilian justification for high-grade enrichment, and that was a very important point in their announcement. Another thing they announced that they can manufacture any type of centrifuge at any pace they want to, and according to this announcement, they are manufacturing 60 new centrifuges a day. What that means, I don't know if this is true or not, and of course we need to take into account that usually they exaggerate their abilities, and of course some of these advanced centrifuges are not that advanced, and maybe they advanced at a slower pace, but we do see Iranian determination, and that's the main message, their determination to continue and promote their nuclear program. They're not rushing to do it. They are not trying to violate too much the existing agreements. But we see that they're very determined to make progress. Let me just say one more thing about this. The IAEA is currently undergoing bilateral negotiations with Iran over the past few months. And according to the materials accumulated following the achievements of the Mossad to bring part of the nuclear archives of Iran, there's now certain information regarding sites not declared by Iran to the IAEA. And now the IAEA is asking the Iranians for permission to visit these sites. Out of 3 sites, they received permission for one site after they, painted it over and changed ground and everything there, but still some residue of nuclear materials were found there. And the two other sites, the Iranians claim they don't exist, that Israel made it up, and they won't allow the IAEA to visit these sites. And over the past few days, we've heard that there's yet another site in which they dealt with a certain metallurgical material, which is mainly used for nuclear weapons. So the indications are that the Iranians are continuing to hide things. Not major things. The recent site I just mentioned, for example, they broke it apart when they realized that somebody discovered it, but they still have the capabilities and the know-how, and now they're making progress based on that capability and know-how. The bottom line is that Iran is, one, continuing with its program. The coronavirus, as severe as it is, did not stop their attempts. Iran does not mean to regress, to go back, unless it will receive some kind of a lifting, even a partial yet significant lifting of the sanctions. President Trump and Eldad Shavit will soon elaborate on that. I don't think that during an election campaign year he can withdraw from his maximal pressure policy. So I don't think that the Iranian precondition for regressing for their nuclear measures will be given in return for merely lifting the sanctions. So as Israelis, we might find ourselves at the end of the year with a serious problem being developed in Iran, that Israel on the one hand is very much concerned, and the U.S. is in peak elections year. And obviously, if a Democratic president will be elected, this could change the entire picture. So that's that regarding the nuclear subject. And now I'd like to hear from Eldad, who will talk about the American policy regarding each of the policies we've heard about so far. The coronavirus crisis does not change significantly the goals of the U.S. regarding Iran. We can see that the decision makers in Washington, what they think now is that the way they have treated the crisis merely increases the pressures. So perhaps from the perspective of the U.S., it would make it easier for the Americans to achieve the goals that they have set. So what is the goal that the U.S. wishes to achieve regarding Iran? That's mainly to use the pressure levers from the administration on Iran and to make it agree to return to the negotiating tables without any prerequisites in order to achieve an agreement that would be better than the one achieved earlier. The administration doesn't specify what this better agreement will look like, but they do mention the nuclear program as well as the regional activities as well. Now, when Trump talks about his perspective regarding the agreement he wishes to achieve, he chose a very narrow goal, and he spoke mainly about the nuclear issue. It doesn't want Iran to become nuclear, and he reiterated that he does not seek regime change in Iran, and he even said that he's willing to help Iran to improve its economy if the Iranians will agree to the American request to return to the negotiating table. He kept repeating that he is personally willing to negotiate with Iran, and he even tried to advance certain measures in order to meet with Rouhani, and he is not hiding the fact that he wishes not to enter any conflicts. I think in the current situation, both Americans and the Iranians agree that it would be very difficult to resume the negotiations. It's important to say that among the administration there are certain individuals, and it seems that the Secretary of State Pompeo is leading American policy towards Iran, and they are still hoping that the pressures will lead the Iranian regime to surrender to the American demands, and perhaps even it will be toppled and a more moderate alternative will evolve. And this is something that Pompeo and maybe others, they are operating under this assumption that maybe they'll get there, at least from the perspective of the U.S. There's also no change in the strategy, no change in the goal, and also no change in the strategy. It continues to rely on that same policy of exerting pressure, especially imposing the economic sanctions. And it's important to state that the administration is very determined to realize and enforce this policy, and it's trying not to give exemptions to different countries to trade with Iran. Another discussion that started in the U.S. recently, that following the coronavirus crisis and the humanitarian issues in Iran, maybe they should ease up on the sanctions. The American administration has ruled out any such option to ease up on the sanctions. They said that they offered humanitarian help to Iran, but Iran refused, but it is not willing to ease up. And during the coronavirus period, it has even exacerbated its approach, imposing additional sanctions on Iranian people and specific Iranian individuals and organizations. And there are various arguments we heard in the U.S., especially by people from, the Obama administration. They said this is a good time to find ways to warm up the dialogue between the two countries, but the Trump administration rejected that. President Trump said only yesterday that he's willing to provide help to Iran if Iran asks for it, but it's important to say that the U.S. continues to stop any attempt of Iran to use this crisis in order to ease up the sanctions, and also it is trying to stop the IMF from giving the loan Iran had requested. So I think that except for adhering to their maximal pressure policy, hoping that it would yield a result, except for that, the American administration doesn't have any comprehensive strategy to deal with that determination that Sima pointed at just a few minutes ago regarding to Iran's phasing out of its commitment in the Jcpoa. And it also doesn't seem that it's very much, interested in doing anything about it. Now they're focused on the dealing with the COVID-19 crisis. And if we look at how Israel views the threat level and how the U.S. views the level of the threat, I think in the U.S. they consider the Iranian violations of the Jcpoa not as threatening or threatful as Israel views it. And there are a lot of differences between what the administration wants and is willing to do and what the Europeans, who are the allies of the U.S. and who are the co-signatories to the agreement, and they still abide by the Jcpoa, and they're trying to develop different mechanisms, but without success, all kind of economic mechanisms that will help out the problems of the Iranians. So that's one thing. Now it's also important to say that beyond what the Iranians are doing in the nuclear domain, and Meir has talked about it, they're doing a lot in the Gulf as well in order to increase the friction with the U.S. and to try and prove to the U.S. that they are still very powerful. There were quite a few events over the past few months. For example, attacks on tankers and the shooting down of an American surveillance drone. The U.S., all in all, did not do that much in order to respond to what Iran has done. Maybe there were some cyber attacks, and of course it culminated with Trump's decision regarding the targeted killing of Qasem Soleimani in Iraq after several provocations of Iran in Iraq, including the killing of an American contractor. And one can say that by doing so, Trump proved that he does have a red line. If American lives are harmed, then he will retaliate. That's been proven, definitely. But since this targeted killing, one cannot say that there's any change in the trend, and the U.S. is still trying to avoid use of force, even afterwards, when Iran and its allies had challenged the U.S. And I think that despite the targeted killing, there is no change in the Iranian evaluation or assessment that the American administration does not want a confrontation. Iraq is one of the main arenas where we find a clash between, or a confrontation between, the U.S. and Iran and its Shiite allies, and Iran focuses its efforts on expanding its involvement and increasing the American involvement. or limiting American involvement. It still has interests, but it finds it very difficult to deal with the Iranian determination, with everything it has at disposal in Iraq. And the Iranians are trying to push the Americans out of Iraq. So far, the American administration has not decided what to do about that. But this issue of continued American presence in Iraq, which is very significant from an Israeli perspective as well, it's still on the agenda of the administration. And Trump, concretely, is dealing with that, but I don't think that he's decided yet. But I think that this is the direction he would like to see happening. Recently, they have been concentrating their forces and the larger forces, the Americans, to make it easier to protect them. They're increasing their aerial defense capabilities. Other members of the coalition have left Iraq, but the U.S. is still there. And of course, if the Americans pull out of Iraq, it will be a great achievement for Iran and the Iraqi militias. Let me say at the bottom line that from the perspective of Israel, we need to realize that there are differences between Israel's interests and the interests of the Americans with respect to the behavior vis-a-vis Iran, whether if we're talking about the regional aspect or the nuclear aspect. And the American leeway is much greater than Israel's, and the goals presented by President Trump in each of these scenarios later, especially if ultimately now or later negotiations between Washington and Tehran will begin, I'm not sure that the Americans' position will be in line with what Israel wants. And I think that this kind of dialogue with the U.S. on the strategic level is very important in order to clarify to the Americans, to remind them what are the red lines and what are Israel's interests. Thank you very much, Eldad. And I think that this would be an appropriate time. I mean, we've talked about each of the key issues Israel is concerned with and related to Iran for a few minutes. And actually, everything that has to do with Iran has a certain impact on Israel. And now I'd like to give the floor to the former Chief of General Staff, Gadi Eisenkot. I'd like to ask you, everything we've heard so far, how does that impact Israel's national security? Well, I think that the coronavirus pandemic is affecting all the countries in the world, and it's also affecting Iran in a very significant way. And, you know, it catches up with it at a very complex reality of ongoing sanctions, of dropping oil prices that have been mentioned, the economic situation, the killing of Qasem Soleimani, and they are paying a price for their efforts for regional hegemony. Up until 3 years ago, let's say, I think they hardly paid a price for this attempt. They mainly had wins in their efforts to gain regional hegemony, but over the past 3 years, they have paid a heavy price in Syria. They've paid a price in Yemen, along with their wins in their confrontational activities. So I think that its three goals are challenged. There's the supreme goal of course, preserving the regime and ensuring a strong country, whether it's religiously, from the security perspective, economic perspective, etc. Also with the effort to achieve regional hegemony. We've seen this in Syria and in Yemen, and to a certain extent in Lebanon. I think that even in the Gaza Strip, and their realization that their ability to invest great resources, as they have invested over the past decades in Lebanon, in Iraq, and Syria, over the past 6, 7, or 8 years, and in the Gaza Strip, now they won't have such an ability to invest so many resources in order to establish the regional hegemony, and also with respect to their desire to develop nuclear capabilities as an insurance policy in such a complex reality. So there are great risks, and I think many of the speakers have mentioned these. But along with the risks, there are also opportunities. As for the question regarding how this impacts national security in such a complex reality that the security establishment in the military are helping out with dealing with the COVID-19 crisis and helping out Israeli society. And there are also the challenges in Gaza and Judea and Samaria and along the northern border, and under such a complex social economic reality. Today it's, complex, and it will become even more complex in the near future. I think what we need is for the security establishment to continue with its monitoring and tracking capabilities and, in all its efforts to prevent the Iranians from making any progress. It's a top priority. So the continued effort to prevent a further establishment of Iran in Syria, and especially regarding strengthening capabilities in Lebanon. And this is something that we've even seen recently, the thwarting of their effort in the northern arena in general, but in Syria specifically, along with the desire to continue and establish their abilities in the Gaza Strip. So the main impact is a continued influence over the main mission of the military and the Mossad over the past decade vis-a-vis the Iranian threat with its three components. So there's the need to keep an eye open on and to continue and invest great resources in order to prevent them from establishing themselves and increasing their precision capabilities. And of course, we need to examine whether there are any opportunities at this point in time to reduce their ability to establish themselves in Syria, and perhaps to even set a goal of keeping the Quds forces far away from Syria as possible. And there was an effort over recent years with U.S. and Russian cooperation. I can also see an opportunity if we're talking about the moderate Sunni Gulf countries in order to reduce impact in the Gaza Strip and to find alternative assistance under such a complex reality in order to stop both the assistance coming in from Iran and the relationship with the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas at a period where with risks. And in general, we're talking about national security. The main perspective is detecting the threats, and it's true. We always need to detect the threats, but we should also examine any opportunities which exist in this complex reality. In the past, the Iranians have reached some very difficult decisions when push came to shove and when reality was a very difficult one. And reality will be difficult. It's difficult for all countries. And I see what's happening in Israel, and I can assume that in Iran, the situation is even much more difficult than what it is here. And it'll take them some time to get out of that situation. It's a close country with a lot of restrictions, and they cannot receive a lot of help, and the pandemic is pretty spread there, even though they're trying to conceal that. So under this harsh reality, we need to look for opportunities in order to advance the state of Israel's interests and the interests of the region, and also the interests of the Americans. Thank you very much, Gadi. And this takes us to the stage in which I would like to divide up the time we have left between two things. First of all, if any of you has a comment, if you'd like to respond to something somebody else said, and it's very important for you to say something about that, please do so. Now I'm going over the questions that come from Facebook. There are a lot of questions. We won't be able to answer all of them, and you've actually answered some of these questions with everything that you've said. But the main issues that seem to concern the general public from their questions, first of all, how does that impact their assistance to Hezbollah? We remember that event that happened just 2 days ago along the fence along the Lebanese border. As a result of it, does Hezbollah, is it feeling more confident that it's more free to act or less? And I'd like to add a question, and you can each comment on whatever issue you wish to, including my questions. A lot of people are asking me this, and somebody asked about this here as well. Could it be that because of its problems, it will decide to export the crisis to encourage Hezbollah to flare up things along the border? Is it possible that instead of focusing on their domestic issues, they will take it outside, either to the Gulf or along Israel's borders? And another point that a lot of people are asking about: will we see an American withdrawal from the region, and is there a chance for some significant dialogue between the U.S. and Iran, which will be in contrast to Israel's interests. So let's return to the previous order of speakers. You each get 90 seconds, and then the director of the INSS will summarize and talk about the implications for Israel. So let's start with Raz, please. I think that I'd like to say something that's true both regarding the domestic aspect and also the regional and foreign aspect. There's no doubt that Iran is challenged. Nobody is disputing that. We've been talking about that for years. Definitely under the American maximum pressure strategy, they're being challenged both regionally, domestically, and internationally. But I think that we must also remember three things, and this is something I've been saying for years now. Hopefully, I'll be proven wrong at some point, but for now it's working. Look, the Iranians are very determined. They are adaptive. We know that they can adapt to situations that some people would say that they wouldn't be able to survive it, and Iran has a very clear strategy and some very clear goals. So when we look at Iran, as we look at Iran over the next few months, definitely the economic situation will deteriorate, will worsen, and the challenges will increase. The targeting killing of Soleimani and the drop in oil prices, all that will impact them. But ultimately, we need to look at things with open eyes, especially if we think about how it impacts us. And we need to ask ourselves, does this, threaten the stability of the regime? And will that lead to a dramatic change in Iranian policy? The way I see things, the probability of that happening isn't that great, isn't that high. Even in this crisis, as I've seen, we don't see the systems collapsing. And people ask me, how do you know? And let me tell you, there are enough sources of information. And, the Iranian opposition, believe you me, if there were any information coming from Iran regarding the crisis of systems and the collapse of hospitals, people, going hungry for food, if that were the case, the people or the Iranian opposition would have had access to this information. And we don't hear that, and I don't think that they're going to change their policy. Everything that held true before COVID-19 will continue to hold true after it. Maybe it will be difficult for them to finance some of the things, but let me remind you, they have found a way to help in the civil war in Syria and help Hezbollah and help the Islamic Jihad, even under very difficult situation of economic sanctions. It does have some impact, but it wouldn't really make a dramatic impact on the Iranian budget. Okay, Liora, please, I concur with the trend that we've heard throughout this discussion. I remember that there was somebody who said something a few years ago who said that actually the Islamic Republic is built on crisis, and if there isn't a real one, it'll make one up because it was born out of crisis and it managed to transcend itself whenever it faces a crisis. So all in all, the policy works. Its policy works, or at least it enables it to survive with a certain level of adaptiveness and the certain things it is willing to allow. And one more thing I'd like to add, and this is something we can identify with, is the ability of the regime to rely on domestic resources. If we're talking about the manufacturing of drugs and medications in local development, sometimes people mock these capabilities, or maybe they exaggerate their capabilities, but they're definitely trying to develop things and advance themselves. And now let me say something about how they are dealing with learning from home for the school children, and we can identify with that here in Israel. This was an opportunity for the people to remind the younger generation that their parents 35 years ago also had to study from home during the Iran-Iraq war. Back then it was done over the TV. Now it's being done thanks to the new technology and the internet and in collaboration with the Sharif University. And I'm talking here about the resources, the human resources that it's not even fully using, but they do have these tremendous human resources. And through the help of the Ministry of Education, they've created an app. It's called Shab, and it helps 16 million school children in Iran study from home. And they had even asked and allowed for something they never allowed in the past, and that's to increase internet speed. And I haven't seen them actually doing so, increasing internet speed, but maybe, it will be much speedier, the internet, than it was. And that could be an opening for voices that we hadn't heard before, but, we're yet to see how that evolves. Thank you, Liora. Remember, we don't have a lot of time. Please make sure your answer is brief. And Meir, please. Well, since people have talked about the survivability, and I agree, I think that it's not a threat in the regime at this point. I think when people are concerned with how will they get food for tomorrow, they don't have time for protest. Maybe, if the recovery is too slow, too disappointed, if people will talk about it being corrupt, maybe we'll see it. But for now, people, they're preoccupied with other issues. They won't go out to protest. That's one point. As for the foreign policy, I think that maybe we will see some short-term changes regarding Iranian strategy. But regarding the question, will it export the crisis Iran? I don't think they will. They're too smart. The Iranian regime knows that even if it goes to war tomorrow, what happens the day after the war? I mean, it's not going to solve Iran's problems. So I think that they will continue with their current policy. It's a very cautious, careful, yet defiant policy in order to achieve long-term objectives without risking the short-term. So, for example, we can see the issue of their assistance to Hezbollah. Hezbollah is not dying, but the assistance to it is reduced. They're very cautious vis-a-vis Israel. What they did with Israel, it was merely a signal. It wasn't a violent act against Israel, not because of the situation in Iran, but rather because of the situation in Lebanon, which is truly terrible. Lebanon is collapsing. And they are thinking about the day after, the Hezbollah. They won't go to war because they think about after 33 days of war against Israel, what then? And the same applies to the Iranians. I think maybe we'll see that they're more cautious and slower on the tactical level without letting go on the things on the strategic level. They're not going to make too many concessions. They are chess players. They think, 3 steps ahead, and chess is not a very speedy game. It takes time to play chess, and they're thinking long term. Thank you, Meir. Eldad. Just 2 sentences. I'm sorry, really don't have enough time left. 2 very brief comments. First of all, I think that Israel and the U.S. have to formulate their policy based on 2 assumptions, basic assumptions. One is that Iran will not collapse, and that this regime will continue to exist, and also that Iran is not going to surrender. I think that eventually both the U.S. and Iran will reach the negotiating table. I don't know when it will happen, but it will happen. And once that happens, Israel needs to make sure that the American interests will be close to Israel's interest. Another point that Israel needs to take into account is that the U.S., even under the current administration and with the next administration, whether it's Trump or a Democratic administration, the U.S. is not going to go to wars in the Middle East. I don't know if it will completely withdraw from the Middle East. I think maybe it still has some interest in the Middle East, but it's not going to be in the same place it was in the past, in which it waged war in the region. It is advancing its interest as much as it can without entering a military confrontation. Thank you, Eldad. Now I'd like to ask the director of the INSS, Amos, to speak, please. We discussed 2 important research questions today. First of all, what did the coronavirus do to the Iranian regime? And more importantly, what did it do to the policy of the Iranian regime in different areas I'll soon get into? And the second question is the impact of the COVID-19 crisis in Iran regarding the conflict between Israel and Iran. I think regarding the conflict between Israel and Iran, we can see one could present 3 theses: without change, cooling down of the conflict, or the Iranians utilizing the opportunity while the entire world is focusing on the coronavirus to do the things that are important to them. Well, and the right answer is actually all of the above, because strategically, there's no change. The Iranians have their long-term goals. Just like Professor Litvak said, they wish to achieve these goals cautiously. They're not rushing anywhere. It's important for them that they safeguard these goals. So in this respect, there's no change. Tactically, I think they are cooling down. You can see how they've taken it down a notch in Syria and in Lebanon. So tactically, they are currently focused elsewhere. As for the question of using opportunities, I don't have enough intel. I hope that the person who replaced me in my previous position does have enough intel, because if I know the Iranians, they are definitely looking for a way to exploit the situation. Let's start with the nuclear issue. This is something that the Iranians have wanted for a long time. It's a long-term aspiration, but like I said, they want to achieve that without paying a price, to reach the brink, the threshold, and then to cross it whenever the time is right for them. It's not COVID-19 that made them get closer to that threshold, but it's the Jcpoa crisis, and I can see them making progress with enrichment, or whether it's the development of R&D for advanced centrifuges. And they're also dealing pretty well with all the good intel that Israel has brought regarding their past violations regarding the PMV. The Iranians, they are dealing with it pretty well, and I think that their progress is the most dangerous thing, and this is what we need to focus on. The other issue is the hegemony. I think that COVID-19 to a great extent has helped them set the Soleimani issue aside. Nobody's talking about it. The effect that was achieved is an important one, but the Iranians are proving to us what we know already, that every leader, every general can be replaced. They have already started challenging the Americans in Iraq again, and in sailing in the Gulf. And the basic Iranian statement that their national security is decided in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, they are still subscribing to that view. As for the stability of the regime, we heard a very clear-cut opinion by all the experts that this regime has known even more difficult experiences. So let's say that it wasn't 5,000 people who died of the coronavirus in Iran. Let's say it was 30,000 people. How does that compare with over 1 million people who were killed in the war with Iraq? This regime knows how to rise to challenges, and we saw how the more radical elements, such as the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, are growing stronger, and that protest, which was kind of on the back burner, completely stopped because of this crisis. So in the short term, the regime is stable. In the long term, we'll have to see what happens with the economy. Are we going to reach that point that, the Iranians will really have to suffer? There were 2 times that this happened over the past 40 years. The first one, the famous case, was at the end of the Iran-Iraq war, and the second time when they opted for the Jcpoa. That's the only 2 times that they did something that runs counter to their ideology. Professor Litvak said, and this was a very unequivocal statement, that the confidence of the Iranians is increasing as a result of everything that's happening. I think that statement was a bit too strong. Gadi Eisenkot presented a different opinion, that they are failing, but definitely they still have not reached a situation that they need to do something that is counter to their goals and ideology. Well, the U.S. and Iran. The U.S. is our ally. The U.S. under Trump has set 12 demands to Iran, and we're willing to sign off on each of these, and even only on 6 of them. But no doubt, when it comes to COVID-19, even though the administration has withstood the pressures to lift some of these sanctions, COVID-19, not so much because of Iran, but rather because of the domestic issues of the U.S. and its economy, and the fact that the president needs to focus now on dealing with a very severe economic and health crisis in the U.S. and also with the upcoming election campaign. So, in the outset, it was quite reluctant to deal with Iran, and now it's even more reluctant, and this leaves Israel at the front, and we need to, first of all, as policy recommendations, we need to reach with our most important allies, or ally, that's the U.S., to coordinate dangerous scenarios that could occur. And I can see two such dangerous scenarios. One is, they're making a substantial progress towards nuclear capabilities. What do we do if that happens? And another scenario, maybe it's not that dangerous, but if it doesn't progress correctly, it will be a threat. We cannot repeat, and that's negotiations. We cannot repeat our mistake in the previous round when we said that we are going to be on the sidelines, we're against this, we're boycotting this. We need to talk to see what are the 3 or 4 most significant problematic items from the Jcpoa and to correct them. And today we can see who will probably be the future Democratic leader of the Democratic Party in the U.S. We need to start to talk with him as well, because to go back to the same Jcpoa we had in 2015, that would be very problematic for Israel towards the second half of the nuclear agreement, which is the more difficult one. The campaign between the wars, that requires a separate discussion, and this is not the forum for that, but we need to discuss that. Already a year ago in the INSS, we brought up the question, is it still relevant, the campaign between the wars? And I think that the fact that the Iranian establishment in Syria and the caution and the fact that they're not investing the same kind of resources and capabilities show that it was the right thing, but it still doesn't mean that we don't need to examine the question that when do we switch from that policy to a different policy. And there was an American research institute that wrote a paper in which it said that there's a lot of rationale to the Israeli campaign between the wars. It's not the same mindset we see in Washington either. We don't do anything because if we do something, it'll deteriorate to war. The realization that you can actually do something without it escalating into a war, and that's the rationale behind the campaign between the wars. Perhaps we need to discuss this rationale with the Americans, and this is very important. The word Russia has not been mentioned in this discussion. Russia, on the one hand, is a very significant strategic support for Iran, but in other areas, its relationship with Israel is more important to it, and there's a certain competition between them in Syria, and we need to constantly see where is it positioned, Russia, in relation to Iran, and what is its ability to advance Israeli interests, whether in the nuclear field or in keeping Iran out of Syria. Now, as for the issue of Iran and Hezbollah, I don't think that anything has changed in this respect, despite the two signals we've seen over this weekend. If it was indeed Israel that attacked this car, we know how to be more efficient in targeting vehicles, both with respect to people and equipment. I think it was merely a signal to a certain access, and then we received a return signal. Hezbollah also knows how to be more efficient in sharpshooting, in IEDs, in anti-tank missiles, and I think that the balance of deterrence and the fact that both sides don't want to reach a confrontation remains the same. That's it. Thank you very much, Sima, who moderated this in such a professional and excellent way. Thank you very much to all the participants, Professor Litvak, Gadi, Eisenkot, Raz Zimmt, Tomer, Liora, and each of you taught us something, definitely. And to all those who research Iran, I'm sorry to tell you that we are going to remain preoccupied with Iran over the next 10 years, with or without the coronavirus. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, and we conclude this discussion with that.